If you were to ask me what makes Tears of the Kingdom stand out from other Zelda games, I would have to say the player freedom. In Tears of the Kingdom, it feels like you can be anything, go anywhere, and do anything all at your own pace. You could be like most people and go through the entire main quest before finishing the game, or you could rush straight to the final boss without even doing a sliver of the main quest. This player freedom started back in 2017 with Breath of the Wild and was a key gameplay element for Tears of the Kingdom as well. This player freedom isn't an accident, as the developers of these games stated as far back as 2018 that player freedom was a big theme for Breath of the Wild, and this obviously followed over to Tears of the Kingdom. Although many people love this newfound freedom and think it should become a formula for future games, many others think that there's too much freedom and they should go back to the way games used to be. I do think it's important to ask if there's a little too much freedom in Tears of the Kingdom since it's such a pivotal part of the game, so let's talk about it. One aspect affected most by the open nature in Tears of the Kingdom is exploration, traversing the world and finding new places. Most games, especially older Zelda games, have the player go from point A to point B with some NPCs or challenges in between. Most games in general follow a linear structure when it comes to exploration, and they know exactly where you're going to go next, while Tears of the Kingdom does the complete opposite. As an example, let's look at Ocarina of Time. In Ocarina of Time, there's a set order for what dungeons you'll come across first. You're required to do the Deku Tree before Dodongo's Cavern, and required to do Dodongo's Cavern before Jabba Juba's Belly, and so on. There's a strict order of areas the player can explore, and without, using glitches, this order can't be altered. And on the other hand, we have Tears of the Kingdom where you can choose exactly what order to do the dungeons in without any restrictions. In fact, the dungeons aren't technically mandatory, as you can go to the final boss without even doing any of them. When it comes to exploration, the game tries to tell you where to go, but you can really do whatever you want. The biggest benefit to this design is that I felt like I was truly in control of my own story. Sure, I was destined to get the same ending as everybody else, but the journey and the story I took to get there was almost guaranteed to be unique and special in one way or another. This was great, but in spite of this benefit, there are still a lot of drawbacks to this completely open exploration. One of the biggest problems for me was that I didn't oftentimes feel accomplished or achieved whenever I stumbled across a key area. All of the towns across Hyrule are easy to access since there are so many paths you can take to reach them, which meant getting to those places didn't give me the same sense of accomplishment I got when I reached important areas in older Zelda games. When I reached an important town or city or even small little area in an old Zelda game, it really feels like you've made some sort of progress, whereas in this game, because you can go anywhere at any time, that progress doesn't feel so natural. It's nearly impossible for the game to do a proper build up to a location in the overworld since they don't know exactly how you'll reach that location. Yeah, there are paths on the map which could lead a player in the intended direction, but considering there are so many branching paths and the player can stray from them at any time, it doesn't really do anything. One of my favorite moments in Tears of the Kingdom is when the player gradually ascends up to the Wind Temple because of the build-up. There's only one path you can take to reach the Wind Temple, so the game was able to focus on that one path and make reaching the destination feel more fulfilling. The same thing goes for the build-up to the Demon King's army near the end of the game. There are no branching paths or alternate routes you can take to reach it. You're forced to go through Gloom's lair and eventually reach the climax, which ultimately felt more rewarding. The other problem with this exploration is that enemy difficulty is completely off the walls. One day you could be listening, relaxing to the birds chirping, slowly riding your horse into the sunset while passing a few measly red bow goblins, and the next day, without making any progress, you could come across a measly white-maned Lionel. Difficulty doesn't really scale at all as you can explore, which means the player is going to find a bunch of areas completely unprepared. The lack of difficulty scaling also means that as the player gains more hearts and stronger equipment, the game won't become more advanced, it'll just become way easier. The only example of enemy difficulty scaling is the bosses, which have different health and damage stats depending on the order you fight them in, which still isn't handled tactfully, but it's good enough. If the game was able to control what areas you accessed in which order, they could appropriately scale the difficulty of enemies and mini-bosses, but since you can go anywhere at any time, enemy difficulty feels completely random. The only real solution I see to this is to do what they did back in the day and unlock a certain region behind an item or ability that the player can unlock at a certain stage of the game. That way they could make sure the difficulty of the enemy matches up with the strength of the player. Someone might say, well, just explore the game in the correct order then, to which I say, then why couldn't they make the correct order more apparent? There are subtle hints guiding the player to where they could go next, like, dude, you should go to Rito Village, they saw Zelda, but they're usually one-off dialogue lines which most people don't pay attention to anyway, so they have very little influence on where the player goes. It may sound like I'm complaining and going boo-hoo crybaby mode for no reason, and while that is 100% the case, I still thought this was worth bringing up. It's not like the open world exploration ruined the game or anything, I just hope it becomes more polished later in the series. IG Aonuma said that in the future Zelda games they're going to have the same freedom, so I bet the exploration side of things will get patched up over time. Now it's time to talk about player freedom in regards to puzzle solving, which I would say was far more egregious at times. Shrines in particular are very easy, even in comparison to the shrines from Breath of the Wild, because there are dozens of ways to cheese through them at any given opportunity. The new runes in particular are more open-ended and free than the runes from Breath of the Wild, which leads to players being able to do things the unintended way a lot more. They tried to prevent this by restricting the player from using auto-build, amiibos, and the sage abilities during shrines, but the runes alone are able to completely break the shrines. I could probably count on my fingers how many puzzle shrines I completed the intended way, if I only had one arm. The dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom are also very open-ended, even more so than the Divine Beasts from Breath of the Wild. While the Lightning Temple and the Wind Temple are pretty hard to cheat through, the Fire Temple and Water Temple are both very easy to break, which takes away from any challenge within the temples. In the Fire Temple, you're supposed to use the minecarts throughout the temple and do all of this stuff, but the temple is a lot faster if you choose to abuse Ascend the entire time instead. And then the Water Temple and Construct Factory are easy to break in a million different ways, not worth mentioning, but I assume you know that already. A part of the reason the dungeons are so easy to cheat through is probably the fact that the player has access to every single rune as well as the sage abilities during them. Seriously, I really do wonder, if they were willing to restrict access to auto-build and the sage abilities during the shrines in order to make them more streamlined, why wouldn't they do this during the temples as well? I would understand if they wanted the theme for the dungeons to be around a certain sage, which they sorta did, but being able to use all of them at the same time is kind of weird. Since there are 4 themed dungeons, it could have been cool to see them do the dungeons based around a specific ability that Link has, like Ultra Hand or Recall. It would certainly be a better way to incorporate the abilities in some way without breaking the dungeons. I still had a lot of fun with the shrines and the dungeons, but I don't think we should understate how many times the freedom felt like it should have been restricted a little bit more for the sake of the puzzles. You can literally complete an entire shrine by just using one bomb arrow rather than doing the intended challenge. If they ever do something like runes again, I just hope that they restrict them a little bit more, because, you know, they're pretty broken. The last aspect of the game I want to talk about in regards to freedom is the way you can unlock information about the story. Tears of the Kingdom basically copied the formula from Breath of the Wild and gave you many distinct memories across the entire map for you to find. Getting these memories was really the only way to piece together the story, since the cutscenes at the end of the 4 temples were all pretty much the same, which is, by the way, another consequence of the player freedom. My biggest problem with the Dragon Tears has never been the memories themselves, but the way you unlock them. Having to explore the entire world to unlock the story is a great idea, but being able to find them in any order can really mess up the pacing. I feel like I've only mentioned this, a dozen times, but I think the majority of players, including myself, found the 8th Dragon Tier as one of their first memories. Not only is this the best memory in the entire game, but it's also one of the most important. Finding this memory completely spoils what happens in regards to Sonia and Ganondorf, making the memories before it far less interesting since you already know what's going to happen. Dragon Tier 7 can also spoil to the player that the Zelda they've been chasing all this time was a puppet. Sure, it's moderately obvious that this isn't actually Zelda, but getting confirmation so early takes away from any surprise the twist could have caused. The unfortunate reality is that sometimes a game has to compromise player freedom in order to deliver a more fulfilling and well-paced experience. Pacing as a whole is probably the biggest problem with Tears of the Kingdom, and that's all because the player freedom. To conclude, is there too much freedom? Yes, don't get me wrong, I think that experimenting and finally abandoning the old Zelda formula is a great idea and has led to an amazing game. I would still argue Ocarina of Time is the best Zelda game with that old formula, and that's the 5th game in the entire series. I'm still pretty glad they moved on to something new with Breath of the Wild. I also think it's important to mention that Tears of the Kingdom is my favorite game, so as much as it sounds like I'm hating, I've never enjoyed a game as much as this one. I can just have a favorite game while also being able to acknowledge the few very small problems that it has. I'm sure that the team working for Zelda will eventually find a nice balance between open and restricted, and create a game as amazing and perfect as Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link.